Frank Harper, my fiancé's father, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant with 40 years of pride in his voice, was halfway through explaining to me how the Marine Corps really worked. He had one elbow on the dining table, his fork resting on a half-eaten piece of roast chicken, and he was talking slowly the way people do when they think the person across from them just doesn't understand. And that's the problem with civilians, he said. They read a few headlines, maybe watch a war movie and think they understand what command means. But leadership in the Corps, that's something you earn. It's not something that gets handed to you. The table went quiet after that. Daniel shifted in his chair beside me. Margaret Harper looked down at her plate. Frank took a sip of iced tea, satisfied with his own speech, and I folded my napkin neatly in my lap, met his eyes across the table, and said very calmly, "Frank, I actually do understand command. I'm the new Marine general assigned to your base." For a moment, no one moved. Not even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick. Frank Harper's face turned the color of old parchment. But to understand how we ended up in that moment, how a simple Sunday dinner in coastal North Carolina turned into the most uncomfortable family revelation of Frank Harper's life, you have to start a little earlier. About 2 weeks earlier, to be exact, I had just taken command of the Marine installation outside Jacksonville, North Carolina. The paperwork still smelled fresh, that particular scent of government ink and processed trees that always signifies something official. My name had barely settled into the brass plate outside the office, the letters still catching light in a way that made them look almost temporary, as if they hadn't yet accepted their permanence. Command transitions are formal things in the Marine Corps. Ceremony, handshakes, speeches, the band playing the hymn while uniforms stand at attention, and families watch from folding chairs arranged on parade grounds that have witnessed similar transitions for generations. But once the ceremony ends, the work begins immediately, and command is quieter than people imagine. It's long days that stretch into longer nights, decisions that follow you home and sit beside you at the dinner table, names of young Marines you learn because you're responsible for them now, responsible for their training and their safety and their futures. At 52 years old, after 3 decades in uniform, I understood that responsibility better than most. I had seen commanders who treated their position like a stepping stone, a box to check on the way to something better, and I had seen commanders who understood that the weight of their decisions would echo through the lives of the men and women under their charge. I had promised myself long ago that I would be the latter. What I hadn't expected was how complicated my personal life would become at the exact same moment. Because 2 months before that command ceremony, Daniel Harper had asked me to marry him. It happened on a quiet evening in Virginia, just after I'd received news of my pending transfer to North Carolina. We were sitting on the porch of my rental house, the kind of humid summer evening where the air feels heavy enough to touch, when he turned to me with those steady brown eyes and asked if I would spend the rest of my life with him. I said yes without hesitation. Daniel wasn't a Marine. He was a civilian contractor who worked in logistics systems for the Department of Defense, practical, thoughtful, patient, the kind of man who listened more than he talked, which is rarer than people think in a world where everyone seems desperate to fill silence with their own opinions. We met 3 years earlier during a readiness project in Virginia, a chance encounter at a planning meeting that turned into coffee, that turned into dinner, that turned into the kind of relationship where you can sit in comfortable silence for hours and still feel connected. He knew what I did. He knew my rank, the career that had defined most of my adult life, but outside work, we rarely talked about the details of my career. Not because it was secret, nothing like that. It was just easier to be Elaine when I wasn't wearing the uniform. And Daniel understood that in a way few people ever had. One evening, about a week after I officially arrived in North Carolina, Daniel came over to my small rental house near the base carrying 2 grocery bags and that slightly nervous smile he gets when he's about to ask for something he's not sure I'll agree to. I recognized the expression immediately, the way his lips pressed together slightly at the corners, the way his eyes darted toward mine and then away. We cooked dinner together, the windows open to the warm coastal air, cicadas humming outside in that endless summer chorus that makes the South feel both alive and drowsy at once. The kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and onions, the sizzle of chicken in the pan, and I found myself thinking how domestic it all felt, how different from the barracks and mess halls that had made up so much of my adult life. Halfway through the meal, he cleared his throat in that deliberate way people do when they're preparing to say something significant. "My parents want to meet you," he said, and I could hear the tension beneath the simple words. I smiled, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "That sounds reasonable. We've been together 3 years. It's about time." He nodded slowly, but didn't quite meet my eyes, and I felt my smile fade slightly. "There's just one thing." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Whenever someone says that, it's never a small thing. In my experience, those 4 words, "there's just one thing," usually preceded news that ranged from mildly inconvenient to life-altering. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit I'd come to recognize over our years together. "My dad's a retired Marine, gunnery sergeant, Vietnam era." I waited for him to continue, sensing there was more coming. And he's traditional," Daniel said, the word coming out heavy with implication. "Traditional how?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew the answer. Daniel exhaled slowly, staring at his plate. He believes the Corps has changed too much. He thinks leadership today is softer, too political, too concerned with things that have nothing to do with combat readiness. "That's not unusual," I said calmly, and it wasn't. Every generation of Marines believes the one that followed has lost something essential, some core truth about what makes the Corps what it is. It's practically a tradition unto itself. "Yeah, but there's more." He hesitated, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. He also struggles with women in command roles. I didn't react immediately. After 30 years in the Marine Corps, that particular attitude wasn't exactly new territory. I had encountered it in various forms throughout my career, from subtle dismissals to outright hostility, from men who seemed constitutionally incapable of taking orders from a woman to those who simply couldn't imagine that leadership could look different from what they expected. I had learned to navigate it, to work around it, to occasionally confront it directly when necessary. But I had also learned that not every battle needed to be fought, that sometimes the most effective response was simply to do my job so well that no one could deny my competence. Daniel rushed to continue, his words coming faster now. "He's not a bad man, Elaine. He's just from a different time. Proud, opinionated. The Corps meant everything to him. It gave him direction when he had none, purpose when he was lost. He sees any change to it as a personal attack on everything he built his identity around." "I understand that," I said, and I did. I had met men like Frank Harper before, men whose entire sense of self was wrapped up in their service, who couldn't separate their own experiences from what the institution had become. "And he doesn't know your rank," Daniel said quietly. That made me raise an eyebrow. What does he think I do? Daniel gave a small, embarrassed laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "I might have told him you're a consultant working on logistic systems." I stared at him, letting the words settle. "You told your father I was basically a contractor." "I panicked," he admitted, his voice small. "You panicked for 3 years." I asked, and despite the situation, I felt a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. He winced, running a hand through his hair. Okay, maybe I kept panicking. Every time I thought about telling him, I imagined the conversation going wrong. I imagined him deciding you weren't good enough before he even met you. I imagined losing you because my father couldn't see past his own prejudices. I couldn't help smiling a little at that. "Why?" I asked softly. Daniel looked genuinely sheepish, his eyes finally meeting mine. Because I knew the second he heard Marine General, the conversation would stop being about you and start being about rank. He would see the title instead of the person. He would spend the entire dinner trying to prove himself, or worse, trying to find fault with you. And I wanted him to meet you first, to know who you are before he knew what you've accomplished. That answer softened me more than he probably realized. In all my years of service, I had been introduced by my rank countless times. It opened doors, certainly, but it also created barriers. People saw the stars before they saw the woman wearing them. They made assumptions about who I was, what I valued, how I would treat them. Sometimes those assumptions worked in my favor, sometimes they didn't, but they were always there, coloring every interaction before a single word was spoken. Meeting Daniel's family as just Elaine sounded almost refreshing. Like stepping out of a uniform I had worn so long I'd forgotten how it felt to be without it. Finally, I nodded. All right. Daniel blinked, clearly surprised. All right, you'll come to dinner. I'll come to dinner. You're sure? Daniel asked, as if he'd expected more resistance. Daniel, I said with a small smile, I've briefed combat commanders and testified before congressional committees. I've negotiated with foreign military leaders and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. I think I can survive Sunday dinner. He laughed with relief, the tension draining from his shoulders. But before the evening ended, he said something that lingered with me long after he left. Just one thing, he added carefully, his voice serious again. My dad likes to talk about the Marine Corps. A lot, and he can be a little intense. I smiled again, unconcerned. That's fine. At the time, I truly believed it would be. What I didn't realize was just how intense Frank Harper could be when he believed he was protecting the honor of the Marine Corps, or how quiet a dining room can become when a man suddenly realizes the person he's been lecturing all evening is the highest-ranking Marine he's spoken to in decades. The drive to Daniel's parents' house took about 30 minutes through the coastal Carolina landscape. Late Sunday afternoon light stretched across the highway, turning the pine trees gold at the edges and casting long shadows that seemed to reach across the road like fingers. North Carolina has a way of feeling both slow and steady at the same time. Small towns with church steeples rising above the tree line, gas stations that still sell boiled peanuts at the counter, porches with rocking chairs where people actually sit in the evenings. It's a different rhythm than what I'd known in my previous postings, a different pace of life that somehow coexisted with the massive military installations scattered throughout the region. Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel, quiet in the way people get when they're thinking too much, when their minds are running through scenarios and preparing for conversations that haven't happened yet. I watched the road for a while, the familiar landscape of military towns, the pawn shops and used car lots and strip malls that spring up around every base in America, before finally saying, "You're nervous." He gave a small laugh that didn't quite mask his anxiety. Is it that obvious? A little. You've been gripping that steering wheel like it might try to escape. He loosened his hands slightly, flexing his fingers. I just want it to go well. My parents, my dad especially, he matters to me. His opinion matters. And I want him to see what I see when I look at you. That's reasonable, I said, and I meant it. Family approval was something I understood, even if my own family history was complicated in different ways. He glanced over at me briefly, then back to the road. My dad can come off strong. Not mean exactly, but certain. He speaks like every sentence is a lesson he's teaching. I've met strong personalities before, I said. The Marine Corps is full of them. That's not exactly what I mean, Daniel said, and I could hear him struggling to find the right words. It's not just that he's confident, it's that he believes he's right, about everything, and he has a hard time hearing anything that contradicts what he already believes. I let him take his time, watching the scenery scroll past the window. He believes the Marine Corps is the most important institution in the country, Daniel continued. He believes discipline solves almost every problem, and he believes people should prove themselves before they speak, before they have opinions, before they act like they know something. Sounds like a Marine gunnery sergeant, I said calmly. That's practically the job description. Daniel smiled at that, a genuine smile this time. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what he is. Even now, even retired for decades, he's still that gunnery sergeant who made it his mission to turn civilians into Marines, to shape raw recruits into something the Corps could use. He doesn't know how to turn it off. We turned onto a quiet residential street lined with modest ranch-style homes, the kind of neighborhood that had probably looked identical 40 years ago, the kind where people stayed for decades and watched each other's children grow up and move away. Most of the houses had American flags out front, some small and mounted near the door, others on proper poles in the yard. A few had Marine Corps flags too, the red banner with the eagle, globe, and anchor hanging limp in the still afternoon air. Frank Harper's house stood near the end of the block. White siding, neatly trimmed lawn, a flagpole in the yard with the stars and stripes flying above a faded red Marine Corps banner that had clearly been there for years, its colors softened by sun and rain. The house looked well-maintained but not new, the kind of home that had been loved by the same family for a long time, its small imperfections worn smooth by familiarity. Daniel parked in the driveway but didn't shut off the engine right away. He sat there for a moment, his hands still on the wheel, staring at the house he'd grown up in. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "We can turn around. We can wait. I can tell them something came up." I said I would. "I just mean if he starts getting intense, if he says something that bothers you, you don't have to sit there and take it. You can leave. I'll understand." I turned toward him, reaching out to touch his arm. "Daniel." "Yeah." "I'm a Marine," I said simply. "A general. I've faced far worse than an opinionated father at a Sunday dinner." He laughed softly, finally turning off the engine. "That's true. I just wanted you to know you have an exit if you need one." "I appreciate that, but I don't think I'll need it." We got out of the car and walked toward the house, my heels clicking softly on the concrete driveway. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a simple blue dress that was feminine without being flashy, professional without being severe. Something that said I was making an effort without trying too hard. I had considered wearing something more casual, but something told me that Frank Harper would notice the details, would read meaning into every choice I made. Frank Harper opened the door before we even reached the porch. He was taller than I expected for a man in his 70s, maybe 6 feet even, with broad shoulders that hadn't quite surrendered to age. His posture was impeccable, that particular straightness that comes from decades of military bearing, the kind that becomes permanent in the spine. His silver hair was cut short in a style that could have been from any decade in the last 50 years, practical and neat, the kind of cut that says the barber knows exactly what you want without having to ask. Even out of uniform, you could see the habits of military service in every aspect of how he presented himself, in the way he stood with his weight balanced evenly, in the way his eyes moved systematically across the scene in front of him, assessing and cataloging. "Danny," he said, gripping his son's hand with a firm shake that I suspected had been firm for as long as Daniel could remember. "Good to see you, Dad." Frank's eyes shifted to me, and I felt that particular weight of being assessed, of having someone form an opinion about you in the space of a few seconds. He studied me the way Marines sometimes study new recruits, quickly, quietly, thoroughly, looking for any detail that might reveal character or capability. "You must be Elaine." "That's right," I said, and I made sure to meet his gaze directly. His handshake was firm but brief, the kind that says I'm being polite without committing to anything more. "Frank Harper." "Nice to meet you." Behind him, a woman appeared in the hallway. Margaret Harper was smaller than her husband, with soft features and warm eyes that had the calm patience of someone who had spent decades balancing a strong-willed partner. Her hair was gray and styled practically, and she wore a simple blouse and slacks that suggested someone who valued comfort over appearance. She moved with an easy grace that came from knowing exactly where everything in her house was, from having walked these same hallways thousands of times. "You finally brought her," she said to Daniel with a smile that reached her eyes. Margaret hugged her son, then turned to me with open arms. "Welcome, Elaine. Come in, make yourself at home." The house smelled like roasted chicken and fresh cornbread, the kind of meal that takes hours to prepare, the kind that says we wanted to make a good impression. I noticed the details immediately as we walked through the hallway, the framed photographs along the wall, a younger Frank Harper in dress blues standing at attention, black and white photos of Marines in formation on dusty airfields decades ago, a folded American flag in a glass case with a certificate I couldn't quite read from where I stood. A shadow box filled with ribbons, medals, and old rank insignia, a career preserved under glass. Frank noticed me looking. "Vietnam," he said simply, the word carrying more weight than its 2 syllables should allow. I nodded respectfully. Thank you for your service. He gave a small grunt that might have been approval, or might have been acknowledgement, or might have been something else entirely. It was impossible to tell with men like Frank Harper, men who had learned to compress their emotions into the smallest possible expressions. We moved into the dining room, where the table was already set with real cloth napkins and what looked like heirloom china. Margaret brought out iced tea glasses, while Daniel helped carry dishes from the kitchen, the two of them moving around each other with the easy familiarity of a family that had shared meals in this same room for decades. Frank sat at the head of the table, the position of authority, and I found myself placed across from him, where he could watch me throughout the meal. Daniel sat to my right, and Margaret took the other end of the table, a position that probably allowed her to observe everything while staying slightly removed from whatever dynamic developed. From the beginning, the questions started. Not rude exactly, but probing, each one feeling like a small test I hadn't studied for. So, Frank said, leaning back slightly in his chair, his iced tea untouched in front of him, Daniel tells me you work with defense logistics. That's right. What kind of work exactly? His eyes were fixed on me, steady and assessing. Coordination mostly, I said, keeping my answers deliberately vague. Systems planning, making sure things get where they need to go. He nodded slowly, processing this, civilian side. Yes. Frank took a sip of tea, and I could see him filing this information away, categorizing me. Well, that's important work, he said. The military runs on logistics, always has. Napoleon said an army marches on its stomach, but really it marches on its supply chain. That's true. Most people don't realize that. Daniel shot me a quick glance, a small warning in his eyes. I kept my expression neutral, giving nothing away. Frank continued, warming to his topic. Back in my day, we used to say amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Meaning the people who understood how wars were really won were the ones thinking about bullets and beans and bandages, not just glory and battle. That's still true today, I said. He seemed pleased by that answer, nodding in a way that suggested I had passed some small test. Margaret brought the food out then, roast chicken with crispy skin, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with bacon in the Southern style, baskets of cornbread still warm from the oven. The kind of meal that belongs to Sunday evenings in America, that belongs to families gathered around tables, that belongs to a tradition of hospitality that transcends the specific people involved. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed pleasant. Margaret asked about where I grew up, a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about a part of the country she'd never visited. Daniel mentioned a fishing trip we'd taken the previous fall, and Frank grunted in what might have been approval at the mention of fishing, a pastime he apparently respected. Frank talked about the town and how much it had changed since the 70s, the new development creeping outward from the city, the traffic that hadn't existed before, the way young people seemed to have no patience for anything anymore. But slowly, inevitably, the conversation turned back toward the Marine Corps. It almost always does when Marines gather, even when some of the Marines are retired, and some aren't technically supposed to exist at all in the conversation. Frank began telling stories from his service, and I could tell these were stories he had told many times before, polished smooth by repetition, each detail in its proper place. Some of them were fascinating, training exercises in the California desert, where the heat rose to impossible temperatures, and young Marines learned discipline the hard way. Long deployments on ships where the only thing keeping people steady was the chain of command, and the knowledge that everyone was suffering together. Stories about gunnery sergeants who had shaped him, about officers who had earned his respect or his contempt, about moments when the abstract idea of leadership became suddenly, urgently real. As he spoke, I could hear the pride in his voice, but there was something else there too, a certain bitterness that ran beneath the surface like an undertow. A sense that the world had moved in a direction he hadn't chosen, that the institution he had given decades of his life to had become something he no longer entirely recognized or approved of. You see, he said at one point, gesturing slightly with his fork. The core used to be simpler. Not easier, never easier, but simpler. You knew what was expected. You knew where you stood. You knew who the leaders were because they had proven themselves. Daniel shifted in his seat, and I could feel the tension radiating from him. He knew where this was going. Frank continued, his voice taking on a lecturing quality. These days, it's all different. Politics and policies and people who have never humped a pack telling the rest of us how things should be done. Margaret gave him a look that I suspected she'd been giving him for decades, a look that said she'd heard this speech before and didn't necessarily approve of its timing. "Frank," she said gently. "I'm just talking," he said, not defensive exactly, but aware that he was heading into territory that made his family uncomfortable. He turned back to me, and I could see him making a decision, deciding to proceed with whatever point he wanted to make regardless of the social signals around him. "The problem today," he said, "is everybody wants authority, but fewer people understand responsibility. Everyone wants to be in charge, but fewer people want to do the work that being in charge actually requires." I nodded politely, keeping my face neutral. "That's a challenge in any organization," I said. Frank leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent on mine. "Let me ask you something, Elaine." "All right. You ever worked around Marines directly? Not just paperwork and systems, but actual Marines face to face?" "Sometimes," I said, which was technically true, if dramatically understated. "Well, then you know," he said, "that command isn't about titles. It's about respect. It's about the look in a young Marine's eye when they trust that you know what you're doing, that you're going to bring them home." He spoke slowly, carefully, like he was explaining something important to a student who was struggling with a basic concept. "Respect has to be earned," he said. "It can't be demanded, and it can't be given just because someone has a certain position." "I agree," I said quietly. Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad, maybe we could talk about something else." Frank waved him off without looking away from me. "No, this is important. If Elaine is going to be part of this family, she should understand. Leadership in the Corps is different from anything else. It's not corporate management. It's not government bureaucracy. It's life and death, and too many people these days treat it like just another career path." I could feel Daniel tensing beside me, but I stayed relaxed, my hands folded in my lap. "Frank," I said gently, "I appreciate the insight. Truly." That seemed to encourage him. He took it as permission to continue, as validation that he was doing something useful rather than something awkward. "Well, let me give you an example," he said. And he launched into a story about a training exercise from the early 70s, young Marines under pressure, command decisions made in seconds, mistakes that could have cost lives if not for quick thinking and steady leadership. The story itself wasn't exaggerated. I had heard similar ones before from men of his generation, and I knew enough about military history to recognize the truth in the details he provided. But as he spoke, his tone slowly shifted from storytelling into something else. Instruction, correction, the kind of voice that assumes the listener doesn't understand, hasn't experienced, couldn't possibly know what it means to make the kinds of decisions he was describing. "See," he said, pointing slightly with his fork for emphasis, "command isn't about being smart. Plenty of smart people fail under pressure. Intelligence is useful, but it's not enough. It's about judgment, character, the kind of backbone you only build through experience. Through being tested and failing and being tested again until you learn what you're actually made of." Daniel rubbed his temple, a gesture of frustration he probably wasn't aware of making. Margaret focused very carefully on cutting her chicken into small pieces, the knife moving back and forth with deliberate precision. Frank continued, building momentum now. "You've got to know how Marines think, how they react under pressure, what motivates them and what breaks them. That's not something you pick up from spreadsheets or PowerPoint presentations or corporate training seminars." "No," I agreed, "it isn't." He nodded, satisfied that I was following his point. "Exactly. And the trouble nowadays is people think leadership can be taught in classrooms, that officers can be produced like products on an assembly line." Daniel spoke quickly, trying to head off what was coming. "Dad, maybe we could." Frank ignored him. They hand out rank like it's just another promotion, he said. Like making general is the same as making senior vice president at some corporation. They forget that every promotion in the Marine Corps means more responsibility, more lives in your hands, more weight on your shoulders. Margaret finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. Frank, that's enough. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, he said, but there was a slight defensiveness in his tone now. He looked at me again, and I could see him trying to gauge my reaction, trying to figure out if he was offending me or simply instructing me. No offense intended, he added. I smiled faintly, letting the expression reach my eyes. None taken. But Daniel had had enough. Dad, he said firmly, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. Elaine understands the military better than you think. Frank raised an eyebrow. Oh, how so? Daniel hesitated, and I could see the conflict in his face. He knew exactly how so, but the moment hadn't come yet, and he was struggling with whether to force it. Because she's worked around it for years, he finally said, which was technically true but so dramatically understated that it felt almost like a lie. Frank gave a skeptical grunt. Working around it isn't the same as living it, he said. Working around it is observation. Living it is understanding. There's a difference, and anyone who's actually served knows it. I let that pass, taking a sip of my iced tea and keeping my expression neutral. The truth was, Frank Harper was right about many things. Leadership in the Marine Corps was different from corporate management. Rank did come with responsibility that went beyond what most civilians could imagine. There was a gap between those who had served and those who hadn't, a gap that couldn't be bridged by reading books or watching movies or even working alongside military personnel in civilian roles. He was right about all of it. He just wasn't right about me. Margaret tried again to redirect the conversation, asking Daniel about his work, about mutual friends from the neighborhood, about anything that might steer them away from the shoals they were approaching. For a few minutes, it seemed to work. The conversation drifted toward safer topics, the tension in the room easing slightly. But Frank wasn't finished with the topic that mattered most to him. After a few more minutes, he returned to it again, unable to let go of something he clearly felt was important for me to understand. You know, he said, leaning back in his chair in a pose of casual authority, the Marine Corps has always been about earned authority. That's what separates us from other branches, from other organizations. In the Marine Corps, you don't get respect just because someone gives you a title. You earn it from the Marines under you. You earn it by proving that you deserve it every single day. No one interrupted him this time. Margaret had apparently decided that he needed to play this out, that trying to stop him would only make it worse. You earn it from the Marines under you, he repeated, speaking slowly, deliberately, making sure each word landed. And the best commanders are the ones who understand the weight of that responsibility. The ones who know that every decision they make affects real people, real families, real lives. His voice softened slightly, and I could hear something genuine beneath the lecturing tone. When young Marines look to you for direction, that's not a management problem. He tapped the table lightly with his finger for emphasis. That's leadership. That's trust. That's sacred. Then he looked directly at me again, and I could see in his eyes that he had forgotten I was supposed to be a potential family member. In this moment, I was simply an audience for truths he believed were important, a civilian who needed to understand something essential about the world he had given his life to. And most people outside the Corps, he said quietly, never really see that side of things. They see the uniforms and the ceremonies and the recruiting commercials. They don't see what it actually means to be responsible for other people's children in situations where your decisions determine whether they come home. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, and I could see his jaw tighten with frustration. I folded my napkin beside my plate, smoothing it carefully. Frank took another sip of tea, satisfied that he had made his point, and I realized something important in that moment. Frank Harper wasn't trying to be cruel. He wasn't trying to belittle me or make me feel small. He simply believed, with the absolute certainty that comes from decades of experience, that he was speaking to someone who couldn't possibly understand what he was talking about. He was defending something he loved, protecting an institution that had given his life meaning, sharing truths that he believed were important for anyone who wanted to understand the military world. And the longer he talked, the deeper he stepped into that assumption. The room fell quiet after his last statement. Margaret looked at me carefully, her eyes holding an apology she couldn't speak. Daniel shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable but unsure what to do, and I realized that this moment was a kind of test, though not the kind Frank Harper thought he was administering. This was a test of character, but it wasn't mine being tested. Finally, I placed my hands lightly on the table. "Frank," I said calmly. "Yes. You're absolutely right." He seemed pleased by that, nodding slightly. "I am." Yes, I met his eyes directly, holding his gaze with the steadiness that came from 3 decades of looking people in the eye during difficult conversations. A person in command does have to earn that title every day. They do have to prove themselves to the Marines under their charge. They do have to understand the weight of responsibility that comes with every decision. Frank nodded once, satisfied. "Exactly." Then I continued, my voice still calm, still measured, still carrying the patience I had learned over years of dealing with difficult situations. That's something I've learned over 30 years in the Marine Corps. Frank blinked, just once. His hand, which had been reaching for his tea, stopped halfway. Then I added quietly, "And I'll be responsible for earning it here as the new Marine general assigned to your base." The room stopped breathing. Daniel froze beside me, his hand landing on my arm as if to steady himself, or to offer support, or simply to acknowledge that the moment had finally arrived. Margaret's fork slipped against her plate with a soft clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. And Frank Harper stared at me like a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet was something else entirely, like someone who had walked confidently across a floor, only to discover it was actually a frozen lake, the ice beginning to crack beneath his weight. Frank Harper didn't move, not right away. His eyes stayed fixed on me across the dinner table, as if he were waiting for the punchline to arrive, the indication that this was a joke, that he had misunderstood something simple and would soon be corrected. The kind of pause people make when they assume they've misheard, when their brain is trying to reconcile 2 incompatible pieces of information. "You're what?" he asked slowly. His voice had lost the certainty it carried 10 seconds earlier, the confident authority of a man explaining the world to someone who needed instruction. I kept my tone calm, neither apologetic nor triumphant. "I'm Major General Elaine Mercer," I said. "United States Marine Corps. I took command of the installation last week." No one reached for their food. No one shifted in their seat. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner that had seemed to stop its rhythm entirely. Frank blinked again, slower this time. His mouth opened slightly, closed, opened again. Daniel shifted beside me, and I could feel the tension radiating from him, the mix of relief and anxiety that the truth was finally out. Margaret looked between the 2 of us like she was trying to put together a puzzle that suddenly had new pieces, pieces that didn't match the image she'd been assembling. Frank leaned back slightly in his chair, a movement that seemed involuntary, as if the air had been pushed out of him. "General," he repeated, the word coming out flat, stripped of its normal meaning. "Yes." His eyes narrowed. Now he was studying me again, but this time not as a curious father meeting his son's girlfriend. Now he was searching for something else, proof, doubt, evidence of deception or exaggeration. Any sign that I might be making a claim I couldn't support. "That's a pretty big claim," he said carefully. "It is," I agreed. Frank set his fork down, the metal clicking against the plate. "You're telling me you're the new commanding general at Lejeune?" "Yes." He stared for another long moment, and I could see him running through calculations in his head, comparing what he knew of me, the woman sitting across from him in a simple blue dress, with what he knew of Marine generals, with what he expected them to look like and sound like and be. He stared for another long moment. Then he gave a short laugh that didn't quite land, that held more uncertainty than humor. "Come on now," he said, but there was a question in the words, a request for clarification. Daniel finally spoke, his voice firm. "Dad." Frank held up a hand. "Danny, hold on." His eyes stayed on me. "You're serious?" "I am." Margaret spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Frank." But Frank was already running through possibilities in his head. Retired Marines develop a certain instinct over time, an ability to read people that becomes almost unconscious. They read posture, tone, details that others might miss. And I could see the moment his instincts started noticing things he'd overlooked earlier. The way I sat, straight but not rigid, the product of years of military bearing that had become second nature. The way I spoke, concise and deliberate, each word chosen with care. The questions I'd asked earlier about base readiness, about the supply chain, questions that made sense now in a way they hadn't before. Frank leaned forward again, a new intensity in his gaze. "If you're a Marine general," he said slowly, "then you'd know the name of the current operations deputy." "I replaced General Wallace," I said calmly. "Colonel Rivera is still acting deputy until the transition review is finished next month." Frank's jaw tightened. That answer landed exactly where it should have, with specific details that only someone in the command structure would know. He tried again, and the readiness inspection scheduled for October. "Moved up 2 weeks," I said. "Logistics backlog from the last rotation. We needed more time to address the discrepancies before the inspectors arrive." Margaret inhaled quietly, a soft sound that seemed to fill the room. Frank's fingers tightened slightly on the table, his knuckles whitening. Another long silence passed. Then Frank sat back in his chair again, and for the first time all evening, the certainty was gone from his face. He looked embarrassed, not angry, not defensive, just stunned. The confident lecturer from moments ago had been replaced by someone struggling to process a fundamental shift in reality. Daniel finally spoke again. "Dad, she told you. She wanted to meet you as a person first." Frank rubbed a hand slowly across his mouth. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. Margaret looked at me with wide eyes. "You're really the general?" she asked gently. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret leaned back slightly, absorbing that. Then she looked at her husband, her expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been sympathy, might have been amusement, might have been both. Frank was staring at the table now, his eyes unfocused. The man who had spent the last half hour explaining Marine leadership to me now had nothing to say. I could see what was happening behind his eyes. Every sentence he had spoken earlier was replaying itself in his memory. The lecture, the explanations, the assumptions, the quiet certainty that I didn't understand command, couldn't understand it, had no frame of reference for what he was describing. All of it was playing back now with a new context that transformed each statement into something else entirely. Frank finally cleared his throat. "Well," he said, his voice rougher than before, "that's something." No one laughed. The tension in the room was too thick for laughter, too heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions that hadn't yet found their expression. Daniel tried to ease the moment. "Dad didn't know," he said. "It was an honest mistake." Frank shot him a look that carried more complexity than simple disagreement. "I gathered that," he said dryly. He turned back toward me slowly, and I could see him struggling to find the right words, to navigate a situation he had never anticipated. "You didn't think to mention that earlier." "I wanted to meet you as Daniel's fiancé," I said calmly. "Not as a rank. I wanted you to see who I am before you saw what I've accomplished." That answer seemed to hit him harder than anything else. His mouth tightened and he nodded slowly. "Right," he said, "right." He picked up his glass of iced tea and took a long drink, his eyes not meeting mine. Margaret finally broke the silence. "Well," she said softly, "that certainly explains why you were so patient." Frank looked up at her, patient. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You spent 30 minutes explaining Marine leadership to a general." Frank winced slightly, a visible flinch that seemed to go through his whole body. Daniel coughed into his hand to hide what might have been a laugh or might have been a sound of disbelief at the situation. Frank gave him a sharp look. "Don't." Then Frank looked back at me, and I could see him trying to find his footing in this new reality. "I suppose I owe you an apology," he said. You don't owe me anything, I said. Yes, I do. He sat straighter in his chair, some of his military bearing returning. I made assumptions. I spoke out of turn. I lectured a superior officer in my own dining room. That happens, I said. Frank shook his head slowly. No. What happened was I talked down to someone who outranks every officer I ever served under. I spent half an hour explaining things you've lived and breathed for 3 decades. I shook my head slightly. Frank, rank isn't the point. It is when you spend half an hour explaining the Marine Corps to a general. Daniel couldn't hold back a quiet chuckle at that, and the sound seemed to break some of the tension in the room. Frank shot him another glare, but there was less heat in it than before. Danny, sorry, Daniel said, but he didn't look particularly repentant. Margaret reached across the table and touched Frank's arm. Frank, breathe. He sighed, a long exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of the entire evening. Then he looked at me again. You really just took command last week. Yes. He let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be. Another pause settled over the table, but this one felt different, less tense, more reflective. Frank shook his head slowly. I've spent 40 years thinking I could read people, he said quietly. Thinking I could size someone up in a glance and know what they were about. I said nothing, letting him work through his thoughts. And tonight I completely misread the highest-ranking Marine I've talked to in decades. I lectured her about leadership like she was a fresh recruit, instead of someone who's commanded at every level from platoon to installation. I gave a small smile. You weren't the first person to underestimate me. Frank nodded once, something shifting in his expression. I imagine not. I imagine that's been a theme throughout your career. In some ways, yes. Margaret smiled faintly. Well, she said, next time someone comes to dinner, maybe we ask fewer questions about their qualifications. Frank looked at her. That's not how Marines work. But there was a hint of humor in his voice now. The first sign that the evening might eventually become something other than an excruciating memory. Daniel leaned back in his chair with visible relief. See, he said quietly to me, not a disaster. I looked at Frank again, studying the man who had spent so much energy explaining things to me, who was now struggling to understand what had just happened to him. No, I said softly, not a disaster. But Frank Harper was still thinking, and I could see that the realization hadn't finished settling yet. What embarrassed him most wasn't the rank difference, wasn't even the fact that he'd been caught making assumptions. It was something deeper, something about the nature of the institution he loved and his place in it. Because Marines, more than anyone, hate realizing they judged another Marine too quickly. The Corps builds itself on the idea that every Marine is a Marine first, that the uniform matters more than what's underneath it, that capability and character count for more than appearance or background. And in one dinner, Frank Harper had violated every one of those principles without realizing it until it was too late. Dinner ended more quietly than it had begun. Margaret cleared the plates while Daniel helped carry dishes into the kitchen. Frank offered once or twice, but Margaret waved him away with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing her husband for decades. I suspected she knew her husband needed a moment alone with his thoughts, needed time to process what had happened and what it meant. I stepped out onto the back porch while the kitchen filled with the soft clatter of dishes and running water, the sounds of cleanup that follow every family meal. The evening air had cooled, the heat of the day giving way to the relative comfort of early evening. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and fell silent. The faint sound of a baseball game drifted from a neighbor's television, the crowd noise and announcer's voice blending into a murmur that was more texture than sound. The sky over the pine trees had turned that deep Carolina blue that always arrives just before full darkness, the moment when the world seems to hold its breath. For a few minutes, I just stood there, letting the quiet settle around me. 30 years in the Marine Corps teaches you that after a confrontation, silence can be useful. People need time to let their pride loosen its grip, to let their assumptions rearrange themselves, to let reality sink and pass their defenses. Pushing too hard in moments like these rarely helps. Patience is the better strategy. The porch door creaked behind me. Daniel stepped out, the screen door clapping shut behind him. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine." He leaned against the railing beside me and let out a long breath. "Well," he said, "that escalated." I smiled faintly, a little. "I'm really sorry about my dad. He shouldn't have talked to you like that." "You don't need to apologize." "Yes, I do. I should have told him earlier. I should have prepared him." "That might not have helped," I said. Daniel frowned. "You think he would have acted the same way?" "Probably not," I admitted. "But then he wouldn't have shown us who he really is either." Daniel considered that, turning it over in his mind. "He's not a bad man," he said quietly. "I know, but he's stubborn. So are most Marines." Daniel laughed softly at that. "That's true. It's practically a job requirement." We stood there for another minute before the porch door opened again. Frank stepped outside, the screen door clapping shut behind him with a sound that seemed final, decisive. He looked different now. The certainty that had filled the dining room earlier had softened into something else, something more careful, more uncertain. "Daniel," he said. "Yeah." "Could you give us a minute?" Daniel glanced between us, his eyes settling on me. "You sure?" "I'll survive," I said. Daniel nodded slowly and slipped back inside, leaving Frank and me alone on the porch. Frank walked slowly to the other side of the porch railing, putting some distance between us. For a while, he just stared out at the darkening yard, the trees at the edge of the property becoming silhouettes against the fading sky. Then he cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "that was a hell of a dinner." I smiled slightly. Yes, it was. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I recognized from Daniel, a family habit passed from father to son. "You know, I've replayed that conversation in my head about 10 times in the last 15 minutes. That sounds uncomfortable." "It is." Frank shifted his weight, his shoulders tight with tension. "I spent half the evening explaining the Marine Corps to someone who commands more Marines than I ever met in my entire career." "That happens sometimes." He shook his head. "No, not usually like that. Not in my own house. Not by someone who sat there and let me dig my own grave." Another silence passed, longer this time. Finally, he turned toward me. "I owe you a real apology." "You already offered one." "That one was automatic," he said. "This one's deliberate." I waited. Frank looked me straight in the eye. "I judged you." "Yes. I assumed you didn't understand the Corps." "Yes. And I talked down to you in my own house like you were a child who needed instruction." I nodded once. That part did happen. He sighed heavily. "You were patient about it. Too patient. Most people would have corrected me a lot earlier." "Probably. Why didn't you?" I considered the question carefully. "Because you weren't trying to hurt me," I said. "You were defending something you care about, something you believe in." Frank looked surprised. "You think that's what I was doing?" "Yes, you were trying to protect the Marine Corps. You were trying to make sure that someone entering your family understood what it meant to you. You were trying to pass on truths that you believe are important. The fact that you aimed those efforts at someone who already knew them doesn't change your intentions." Frank leaned back against the railing, processing this. "You're being generous," he said. "I'm being accurate." He stared out across the yard again. "The Marine Corps gave me everything," he said quietly. "Discipline, direction, pride, a sense of who I am. When you spend that much of your life inside something like that, you start thinking you know exactly what it looks like. You start thinking you can recognize it anywhere." I understood that feeling. "And tonight," he continued, "I realized the Corps moved forward without asking my permission. It became something I don't fully recognize, something I didn't get to approve." "That tends to happen." Frank chuckled softly at that. "Yeah, it does." He looked at me again. "I didn't expect you." "In what way?" He hesitated. Then he said the honest thing. "You're not what I imagined when I heard the words Marine General." "I've heard that before." "I'm sure you have." Frank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You know what bothered me most tonight?" "What?" "It wasn't that you outrank everyone I ever served with. It wasn't even the embarrassment of lecturing a superior officer. It was that you sat there and listened to me talk like an idiot without losing your temper. You let me go on, and you never once tried to shut me down. That's called discipline, I said. Frank nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess it is. The kind of discipline I spent decades trying to teach younger Marines. The kind I forgot to practice myself tonight. Another pause passed. Then he said something I hadn't expected. You love my son. Yes. That's why you came tonight. You wanted to meet his family, regardless of the complications. Yes. He looked down at the porch floor for a moment. Danny's a good man. He is. And if he's chosen you, Frank shook his head slightly. Well, I clearly misjudged the situation. And the woman. I smiled. That happens to all of us eventually. Frank gave a tired laugh. I just wish mine hadn't happened over roast chicken and mashed potatoes. That's better than it happening during a training exercise, I said, or in a combat zone. He considered that. Fair point. The porch light flicked on automatically above us as the sky darkened fully, the sensor reacting to the fading light. Frank straightened a little, some of his military bearing returning. You know, he said slowly, there's something else I should probably tell you. What's that? I've spent a long time telling younger Marines that respect has to be earned. That's true. But what I forgot, he continued, is that respect also starts with listening, with giving someone a chance before you decide what they're worth. I nodded once. Yes, it does. And for the first time that evening, Frank Harper looked less like a man defending his past and more like a Marine ready to learn something new. Frank called me 2 days later. I was in my office at the installation headquarters, the vast bureaucracy of a major military base humming around me, when my assistant stepped in and said, "Ma'am, there's a Mr. Frank Harper on the line. Says it's personal." For a second, I just looked up from the paperwork on my desk, surprised. Frank Harper. I hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. Put him through, I said. There was a short click, and then Frank's voice came across the line, quieter than I remembered, more hesitant. General Mercer. Elaine is fine, I said. He cleared his throat. I suppose it would be under the circumstances. There was a small pause. I won't take much of your time. I was hoping you might agree to meet me somewhere. What did you have in mind? Well, he said slowly, I thought maybe the base museum. The memorial garden out front. It seemed like the right place for this conversation. That made sense. Retired Marines tend to think best around the history of the Corps, surrounded by the artifacts and memories of service. I can do that, I said. Thank you. We agreed on Thursday afternoon. The museum at Camp Lejeune sits near a small memorial courtyard. Stone walkways wind between bronze plaques, names etched into granite walls, the kind of place where people instinctively lower their voices. It's a space designed for reflection, for remembering, for connecting the present to the past in a way that honors both. Frank was already there when I arrived. He stood near one of the statues, an old bronze Marine in combat gear staring toward the horizon, rifle at rest. Frank had his hands clasped behind his back, the way Marines stand when they're remembering something serious, when the weight of their own service presses down on them. When he saw me approach, he straightened immediately, old habits asserting themselves. General, he said. Elaine, I reminded him gently. He nodded. Right. For a moment, we both looked toward the memorial wall, giving ourselves time to settle into the space. You served in Vietnam, I asked. Frank nodded. 71 to 72, near Da Nang for most of it. That was a hard year. They were all hard years over there. Different kinds of hard, but hard. We walked slowly along the path, our footsteps quiet on the stone. Frank stopped near a plaque listing the names of Marines from North Carolina who didn't come home. I come here sometimes, he said, when I need to remember what matters. I understand. He took a breath. Elaine, I didn't ask you here just to apologize again. All right. I asked you here because I wanted to do it properly, in a place that means something to both of us. I waited, letting him find his words. Frank turned toward me. Sunday night, I behaved like a fool, That's a strong word, he said before I could respond. But it's the right word. I spent decades telling younger Marines that humility is part of leadership, that the best leaders are the ones who never stop learning. Then the moment I met someone who represented the next generation of leadership, I dismissed her. I assumed I had nothing to learn from her. I stayed quiet, letting him continue. And the worst part wasn't the embarrassment, he said. What was it? The realization that I had been clinging to an old picture of the Corps. He gestured toward the memorial. The Marine Corps I remember was full of men who looked like me, who thought like me, who came from the same places I came from, and I convinced myself that was what made it strong. I nodded slowly. Times change. They do. Frank sighed heavily. But somewhere along the line, I started believing that if things changed too much, maybe what we did back then didn't matter anymore. Maybe the Corps I served in was being erased. That's not how history works, I said gently. He looked at me. No. No, the Corps you served built the foundation the rest of us stand on. The discipline, the values, the traditions, they didn't disappear. They evolved. They adapted. But they're still there. Frank seemed to think about that. You really believe that? I do. I've served with Marines who weren't born when you retired, and they still carry the same spirit, the same commitment, the same willingness to put the mission and their fellow Marines above themselves. He nodded slowly. That helps. We continued walking, the path winding between memorials. After a few moments, Frank spoke again. Can I ask you something? Of course. How did you stay so calm Sunday night? How did you sit there and let me go on without saying anything? I smiled slightly. Training. That's it. Mostly, I paused, considering how to explain. Part of it is experience. When you've been in command long enough, you learn that reacting emotionally rarely improves a situation. You learn that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Frank chuckled. That's not how gunnery sergeants usually operate. I know. Gunnery sergeants are supposed to correct people immediately and thoroughly. Exactly. He looked thoughtful. You know what surprised me the most? What? That you didn't humiliate me. You could have revealed who you were at any point during that dinner. You could have let me keep talking and then dropped it on me like a bomb. But you waited until I was done, until I'd said my piece, and then you told me the truth calmly. No anger, no superiority. I wasn't trying to humiliate you. You could have. Most people would have been tempted. Maybe, but what would that have accomplished? You would have been embarrassed, I would have felt briefly satisfied, and the relationship would have been damaged beyond repair. I chose a different path. Frank nodded, and you didn't. We reached a bench overlooking the memorial garden. Frank sat down slowly, his joints protesting after standing for so long. I talked with some of the guys from my old veterans group yesterday, he said. Word travels fast in a small town. I smiled. I imagine it does. Frank rubbed his hands together. One of them said something that stuck with me. What was that? He said the Marine Corps has always adapted. Every generation thinks the next one is doing it wrong. Every generation complains about changes they don't understand. But the Corps keeps going. That's a common opinion. Frank nodded, but he also said something else. What? He said, if the Corps trusted you with command, then maybe I should too. I sat down beside him. That sounds like a wise friend. He's 91, Frank said. Served in Korea and Vietnam both. At that age, you start listening more carefully to what people say. We both laughed softly. Then Frank grew serious again. There's one more thing, he said. What's that? My son, he loves you. I can see it when he looks at you. I've seen it for years. Yes, he does. And if you're willing to put up with his stubborn old father, he paused. I'd like the chance to start over. I studied him for a moment. What would starting over look like? Frank thought about that. Well, he said, for starters, I'd like to invite you back to dinner. A proper welcome this time. I raised an eyebrow. That's brave. He smiled faintly. This time, I promise not to explain the Marine Corps to you. That's probably a good plan. Frank nodded. And maybe, he added, you could explain a few things to me instead, about how the Corps has changed, about what it looks like now. I'd like to understand better. I stood and offered him my hand. I'd be happy to. Frank shook it firmly, the grip of a Marine who meant what he said. And for the first time since Sunday night, the weight of that awkward dinner felt like it had finally begun to lift. A week later, Daniel and I drove back to his parents' house. The same street, the same flag in the yard, the same white house at the end of the block, but the feeling in the car was completely different. The anxiety that had filled the previous drive was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that felt more like anticipation than dread. Daniel glanced at me as he turned into the driveway. You sure you want to do this again? I smiled. Daniel, I've deployed to conflict zones. I've negotiated with hostile foreign commanders. I think I can survive another Sunday dinner. He laughed softly. That's not exactly the same thing. No, I said. This one matters more. He raised an eyebrow at that. Family always does. Daniel nodded slowly and turned off the engine. For a moment, we sat there quietly. Then he reached over and squeezed my hand. Thank you, he said. For what? For giving my dad another chance. For not walking away after that dinner. I looked at the Marine Corps flag moving gently in the breeze. Everyone deserves one. A second chance. The opportunity to be better than they were. Frank opened the door again. But this time he didn't stand stiffly in the doorway studying me. Instead, he stepped forward immediately. Elaine, he said, and before I could even respond, he extended his hand. Not the quick handshake from the first dinner, perfunctory and brief. This one was steady, warm, respectful. Good to see you again. It's good to see you too, Frank. Daniel stepped past us into the house, more relaxed than I'd seen him in weeks. Margaret appeared in the hallway just like before, though this time she was already smiling. Well, she said warmly, this looks much more promising than last Sunday. Frank gave a quiet grunt. Let's not relive that too many times. Margaret laughed. I plan to bring it up for at least the next 10 years. It's too good a story to waste. We all moved into the dining room again. The table looked familiar. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, the same meal as before. Frank noticed me glancing at the food. Margaret insisted on the same meal, he said. She said we needed to rewrite the memory. Why? Daniel asked. Margaret set down a bowl of cornbread. Because if we're going to rewrite the memory, we might as well start from the same place. Replace the old dinner with a new one, same food, different conversation. I smiled. That's a thoughtful strategy. Frank pulled out my chair before sitting down himself. A small gesture, but an intentional one. A sign of respect that hadn't been there before. Dinner began quietly at first. Margaret asked about my week on base. Daniel talked about a project he was finishing. Frank mostly listened, a change from the last time we'd gathered around this table. Halfway through the meal, he finally cleared his throat. Before we go any further, he said. Daniel looked up. Margaret paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. Frank looked directly at me. I'd like to say something. The room went still. Frank placed his hands flat on the table. Last Sunday, I made a mistake, a significant one. No one interrupted. I judged Elaine before I knew her. He glanced at me briefly, then back to the others. I assumed things about her experience, about her understanding of the Corps, about her right to speak on topics I thought I owned. He looked at Daniel, and I embarrassed myself in the process. Daniel opened his mouth to say something, but Frank shook his head. Let me finish. He turned back to me. The Marine Corps taught me that respect is something you earn. I nodded slightly. But what I forgot, Frank continued, is that respect also starts with listening. With giving someone a chance to show you who they are before you decide what they're worth. Margaret gave him a small approving smile. Frank continued, I spent years telling younger Marines not to underestimate people, to look past their assumptions. He paused, and then I did exactly that. I underestimated someone based on how she looked, on what I thought I knew about her. The honesty in his voice filled the room. I'm proud of the Corps I served in, he said. But I'm also proud that the Corps continues without me, that it becomes something new while holding on to what matters. He looked at me again, and I'm proud that someone like you is leading it now. The silence that followed was different from the one the week before. This one felt warm, healing, the kind of silence that comes after something difficult has been resolved. Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly relieved. Margaret wiped the corner of her eye discreetly. Frank took a breath. And if you're willing, he said, I'd like to welcome you to this family properly. I met his gaze. Thank you, Frank. He nodded once, satisfied. Dinner continued after that, but this time the conversation was easier. Frank asked thoughtful questions about how the Corps had changed, about the challenges facing today's Marines, about my career path, and the experiences that had shaped me. I told him about the Marines currently serving under my command, about their dedication and their struggles. I told him that the discipline hadn't disappeared, that the standards were still high, that the mission was still the same even if the methods had evolved. Frank listened carefully, and every so often he nodded the way Marines do when they hear something that makes sense. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't lecture. He just listened. After dessert, Daniel stepped outside to take a phone call from work. Margaret went to the kitchen to start cleanup. Frank and I ended up alone at the table, coffee cups in front of us. He leaned back slightly. You know something, he said. What's that? I spent most of my life believing leadership had a certain look, a certain sound, a certain shape. What kind of look? Older, he said honestly. Louder, probably male, definitely more like me than like you. I smiled faintly. That used to be common. Frank nodded. But after meeting you, after watching you handle that dinner, I realized something. What's that? Real leadership doesn't have a look. It has a feel. It feels like strength without bluster, confidence without arrogance, discipline without cruelty. He tapped the table gently. And patience. The kind of patience that can sit through a lecture without fighting back. The kind that knows when to speak and when to stay quiet. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. We sat quietly for a moment. Then Frank added one more thought. You know what the strange part is? What? If you hadn't stayed calm last Sunday, if you'd revealed who you were the moment I started talking, I probably would have stayed stubborn. I would have convinced myself you were showing off, throwing your rank around, trying to make me feel small. I would have dug in and refused to learn anything. That happens sometimes. Frank nodded. Turns out the most powerful kind of revenge isn't humiliation. It's not making someone feel small. I raised an eyebrow. What is it? Grace, showing someone what dignity looks like by example, giving them room to realize their own mistake without forcing it on them. Margaret returned from the kitchen just then. You too, solving the problems of the world out here. Just learning a few things, Frank said. She smiled. Well, that's progress. More than that, it's a miracle. Later that evening, Daniel and I walked back to the car. The porch light glowed warmly behind us, and I could see Frank standing in the doorway beside Margaret, watching us go. Daniel started the engine and looked at me. That went a lot better. Yes, it did. We drove slowly down the quiet street, passing houses that were winding down for the night, lights flickering behind curtains, televisions glowing blue through windows. And as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, I thought about how strange life can be, how the moments that seem like disasters sometimes become the foundation for something better. Sometimes people imagine revenge as something loud, something sharp, something that humiliates the person who wronged you. They imagine the satisfaction of watching someone else feel small, of turning the tables, of delivering a blow that leaves a mark. But after 30 years in the Marine Corps, I've learned something different. The strongest response is often the quietest one. The moment when dignity speaks louder than anger. The moment when grace disarms pride without destroying it. The moment when someone realizes their own mistake because you gave them the space to see it. And sometimes that moment changes people more than any argument ever could. It changes relationships. It changes families. It changes the story we tell about who we are and who we can become. Frank Harper came into that first dinner certain of who I was and what I didn't understand. He left that second dinner certain of something else entirely, not just about me, but about himself, about the institution he loved, about the world he lived in now instead of the one he remembered. That's not the kind of revenge you see in movies. It's not dramatic or explosive or immediately satisfying, but it's the kind that lasts. The kind that builds something instead of destroying it. The kind that turns an enemy into an ally, a critic into a supporter, a difficult father into a genuine member of the family. And in the end, that's worth more than any moment of triumph. That's worth more than being right. That's worth more than watching someone else feel the weight of their own mistakes. That's the power of grace. The climax of this story came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a moment of quiet revelation that fundamentally shifted the power dynamic in the room. When I finally spoke the words, "I'm the new Marine general assigned to your base," the entire evening transformed. Every sentence Frank Harper had spoken, every lecture, every assumption, every patronizing explanation suddenly took on a new meaning. The power that he had assumed was his, the authority of experience, the right to instruct. All of it evaporated in an instant. What made the revenge so satisfying wasn't that I humiliated him. It was that I gave him the space to humiliate himself. I let him build his own trap and walk into it, let him construct an entire worldview that placed me beneath him, and then I simply revealed the truth that dismantled everything he believed about the evening. The look on his face, the color draining away, the silence that filled the room, these were the markers of a perfect revenge, one that required no cruelty, no raised voices, no aggressive confrontation. The revenge was in the waiting. Every moment I stayed silent, I was collecting material. Every lecture he delivered was another brick in the wall that would eventually collapse on top of him. And when I finally revealed the truth, I did it calmly, without anger or satisfaction, which made it all the more devastating. There's a lesson in this story that goes beyond the satisfaction of a well-executed revelation. It's about the assumptions we make about people and how those assumptions can blind us to reality. Frank Harper was a good man who had served his country honorably, but his certainty about what leadership looked like prevented him from seeing leadership when it was sitting across the table from him. The grace I showed that evening wasn't weakness. It was a different kind of strength, the kind that can endure insult without retaliating, that can wait for the right moment instead of forcing one, that can prioritize relationship over being right. In the end, that grace accomplished what anger never could have. It created the possibility of a genuine relationship, of mutual respect, of a family that could move forward together instead of being permanently fractured by a single difficult evening. Revenge isn't always about hurting someone back. Sometimes it's about showing them who you really are and giving them the chance to adjust their assumptions. Sometimes it's about proving that you're better than they expected without ever saying the words. Sometimes it's about the slow, patient work of transformation instead of the quick satisfaction of humiliation. If this story gave you chills, if it reminded you of a time when you chose grace over anger and watched something beautiful emerge from a difficult situation, smash that like button and tell us in the comments. What's the most satisfying way you've ever seen someone proved wrong? Have you ever experienced a moment where patience and dignity accomplished what fighting never could? I want to hear your stories. And of course, subscribe for more stories about family, about military life, about the unexpected ways that justice can be served, and about the power of grace in a world that often seems to reward the loudest voices. This has been a story about a dinner, a revelation, and the moment when a father learned that respect goes both ways. Until next time.